On the morning of the 27th of November, 1944, the countryside near Hanbury in Staffordshire appeared quiet. The war in Europe was still being fought, but there were no enemy aircraft overhead. No air raid sirens were sounding. Then, at 11 minutes past 11, the ground erupted. Thousands of tons of bombs exploded beneath the countryside. Buildings vanished. A nearby farm was completely destroyed, and an enormous crater was torn into the landscape. Around 70 people lost their lives. It remains the largest explosion ever recorded on British soil. But outside the surrounding villages, the story of RAF Fauld is now largely forgotten. The disaster began with an unusual decision made before the war. Near the village of Hanbury were the abandoned workings of a gypsum mine. Its enormous underground passages were cool, dry, and hidden from the air. In 1937, as another European war became increasingly likely, the Air Ministry acquired the site. The old mine was converted into No. 21 Maintenance Unit, one of the Royal Air Force's most important ammunition stores. Its tunnels were roughly 12 feet high and 20 feet wide. A narrow-gauge railway carried bombs through the underground network, while larger railway sidings connected the depot to airfields across Britain. By 1944, thousands of tons of bombs, shells, detonators, and ammunition were stored beneath the Staffordshire countryside. The depot was known locally simply as the Dump. More than 1,000 people worked there, including Royal Air Force personnel, civilian employees, and almost 200 Italian prisoners of war. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and exceptionally dangerous. Bombs arriving at Fauld were not always ready to be stored. Some had been damaged, rejected, or returned from operational airfields. These weapons sometimes had to be inspected, repaired, or have their explosive components removed. By late 1944, the depot was under enormous pressure. Britain's bombing campaign required a constant supply of ammunition. Staffing, training, and supervision struggled to keep pace with the work. Deep underground, thousands of explosive weapons were being handled every day. Shortly after 11 o'clock on Monday morning, workers were carrying out their normal duties. Then came two enormous explosions, almost on top of one another. Around 3,500 tons of high explosives detonated inside the mine. The earth above the storage chambers was lifted and shattered. Witnesses saw columns of smoke climbing thousands of feet into the sky. The blast created a crater approximately 100 feet deep and 250 yards across. Upper Castle Hayes Farm, which stood above the mine workings, was obliterated. A nearby reservoir was destroyed, and millions of gallons of water, mud, and debris poured towards the neighbouring plasterworks, trapping and drowning workers. Buildings were damaged across the surrounding countryside. Debris struck the village of Hanbury, and the explosion was felt miles away. The precise instant that began the explosion can never be known with certainty. Almost everything close enough to provide evidence had been destroyed. However, the investigation pointed towards a dangerous method being used to remove an explosive component from a bomb. Instead of using the approved wooden tool, workers may have used a metal chisel. A spark, impact, or friction could then have ignited the explosive. But the disaster could not be blamed on one action alone. The investigation identified staff shortages, inadequate training, weak supervision, and confusion over responsibility. Wartime pressure had encouraged the depot to process ammunition quickly, while safety procedures were not always followed. The explosion may have begun with a single mistake. The conditions that made that mistake catastrophic had developed over time. Approximately 70 people were killed. They included Royal Air Force personnel, civilian workers, Italian prisoners of war, employees at the plasterworks, and members of local farming families. Some died in the initial explosion. Others were killed by collapsing buildings, flooding, or toxic fumes. 18 of the victims were never recovered. Rescue teams entered damaged tunnels despite the danger of further explosions. Survivors who had escaped returned underground to search for colleagues. For the local community, this was not simply a military accident. Entire families had lost relatives, homes, and livelihoods within seconds. Details of the investigation remained secret for decades. Parts of the surviving underground depot continued to be used after the disaster, but the damaged sections were sealed. Today, woodland has grown over much of the site. From a distance, the landscape can appear peaceful, but the crater remains. It is still Ministry of Defence property, and unexploded ammunition is believed to remain buried beneath the ground. Warning signs prohibit entry into the most dangerous areas. The quiet Staffordshire countryside still carries the physical scar of what happened there. At 11:11 on a Monday morning in 1944, an underground store intended to protect Britain's wartime ammunition became the site of the greatest explosion the country had ever experienced.